Hi, good evening, everyone. This is Charlotte. Um, I'm not sure if you know, but you may have I've certainly mentioned it before that I'd written a book called Blossoming in the Darkness. It's the story of a transgender woman, basically me, and it's available on Amazon if you're interested in buying and reading it. I think it's available to read as hard copy, or you can read it as a Kindle as well. But I thought it might be quite interesting to read this book. Piece at a time, maybe, just to give you a bit of a story of the background of my life. It's really, in many respects, it's an autobiography of my life, which has been traumatic like many trans women, but probably with added extras in terms of drugs and violence. I was arrested for suspected firearms offence. Bit of a funny story behind that. It wasn't actually a gun, it was actually an umbrella. And that's the truth. But just in case there's any police watching this, believe me, that's true. Anyway, so I thought I'd start to read a piece at a time and just release this as and when. So maybe a piece every week, I don't know, maybe a piece every few days. So if you're interested, you can keep up with the story. Anyway, the first chapter is called The Revelation. So it really focuses around the start, really about my visits to a therapist in Bradford-on-Avon after the breakdown of my marriage, and a lot of other stuff as well. Suicide was obviously, like many transgender people, men and women, it's a big part of our lives, and not all, but certainly many. So it really focuses around that. It took a lot for me to find a therapist that I think I would feel comfortable with. And if you've ever looked at therapists and started examining how many there are, there's actually a lot, and you can trawl through until you find the one that you think works for you. And that's exactly what I did. I went through the internet, looked at lots of different therapists, and eventually focused on this one person who I thought, yeah, she'll do. And I don't know why. Maybe it's a bit of a gut reaction with all of these things for all of us, much the same as many things in our lives. And that was it. So it was interesting because she'd never had experience with a transgender person before. So it was a bit of a learning curve for us both. So we were both going to learn. I think it's a bit of a journey. So anyway, I won't bore you anymore with that. I'll just start reading a portion to you. And if I make any mistakes along the way or whatever, then I apologise now. Charlotte arrived at a therapist's office for the first time, parked her car and sat there with her favourite classical music playing. The engine of the car was still running as it was cold outside, so she left the engine running to keep warm. She was early and sat looking at the old building that sat before her, that at one time would have formed a stately home for some wealthy textile manufacturer at a time when the textile manufacturing business in England had been a vast money-making industry. Things had changed a century before, and the textile mills closed down and sat empty for years, just like this once glorious country home. It had fallen into some disrepair, as many had over the years. Few remained to be large stately family homes, but most had been demolished to build numbers of new homes or had been converted into apartments. This building was no different. She could see the scaffolding sitting at the front of the building, clearly idle, having been erected to make repairs to the outside of the property, but seemingly never completed, or maybe never even started. A green covering had built up over a period of time, indicating that there had for some unspecified time been nothing happening. The orange debris netting was worn and hanging in places, blowing in the wind, and bits of rubbish with an old shopping bag had caught itself in the netting and was making an annoying rattling sound. A couple of chickens ran around the overgrown grounds, going nowhere in a hurry, like children without a purpose. The car park was in need of attention, and sitting there was an old football that maybe belonged to a child or a dog. It was hard to say. It was flat, punctured at some stage in its life, useless, rather like herself, she felt. She felt that she was taking up space on this planet that she did not deserve, as she felt that she did not use it for the good of others or even the good of herself. She felt selfish, that she only ever thought about herself, her troubles, and if she did think about the well-being of others, it was that she just thought about it and did nothing more than that. She could feel herself sinking into hopelessness as she looked back over her life and the uselessness of it all, the pain she'd inflicted, the heart she'd broken, and the life that had been lost, never to be returned. There were only 2 other cars in the car park, neither of them impressive, both mediocre and to some degree boring. One obviously belonged to someone who was disabled, as there was a disabled sticker in the back. The other was old and tatty and had seen better days. Charlotte wondered what the therapist would be like, what she would think about Charlotte being transgender and the transgender community as a whole. She knew different people had differing views about it, some accepting, but some were very anti-transgender people, and it was impossible to guess where she stood, but she would soon find out. She had already prepared the therapist by writing to her about her condition, so she knew it would not be a shock, and to some degree felt that the fact that the therapist was seeing her was positive. Charlotte was broke, money was in short supply, so her sister had paid for the therapy session or she would not be there. She was still paying for the family home and trying to now pay for herself and her own accommodation as well. She was seeing the therapist because of her suicidal tendencies, which had torn her life apart for over 40 years. It had been a lifelong dilemma, which had nearly been concluded on many occasions through attempted suicides. She was dressed as John, not as Charlotte, and to all intents and purposes, to anyone she met, she was male. The changing scene of her body was not obvious to anyone other than herself, unless of course she was naked, and then the budding breasts and the large hard nipples would be seen. Her skin was the most noticeable change, as it had softened massively, and she had developed some puppy fat in her tummy region. Hair growth had reduced massively on her body, and she no longer had to shave her legs and armpits as often as she once did. The hormone replacement therapy was working and taking effect, but it was a slow process. She was older, and that had its drawbacks. Time had set itself in her body, and changes that could take place for someone much younger would not happen for her. She had to face it. She was born too early, 40 years too early. She wondered if it was appropriate to call it hormone replacement therapy, as in reality she wasn't replacing, lost, but putting something there and changing the balance as what had always been there but out of sync. There had always been estrogen, but it was limited in volume compared to testosterone, which had had the preeminence in her body. She hated it. It was wrong to her. Why had it been that way? She had often prayed and screamed out that one night she would go to bed male and wake up female, that the pain of being in the wrong body would be gone forever, and she could be who she was meant to be. She felt that she was dysfunctional, a bit of a freak. She was in a way now going through a second puberty, but this time as a girl, not as a boy. If only it had been this way in childhood, she wished. She watched the clock move on with minutes to go before she was due for her first appointment. Charlotte was punctual, her pet hate being people who were late, particularly when there was no reason. She recalled the Sunday mornings trying to get the three young children ready for church and into the car. There was the regular countdown of minutes, and it was like a NASA countdown to a launch. Looking back, she wondered if this was all part of her OCD issues and her anxiety. She was now very nervous, and anxiety was once again kicking in. She felt like she wanted to put the car into reverse and head back out the way she'd come, and back to safety into the secrets and the darkness of her own world. But she was here, and it was time to leave the solitude and safety of the car and head to the house. It was once clearly an impressive house, and she could imagine the days when horse-drawn carriages would arrive and leave with the rich and wealthy. They were days gone by, and now only the residents who lived there, whoever they were, would come and go. Charlotte turned off the engine, opened the door of her car to be hit by the cold of the day. It bit into her like a sharp knife, slicing into her skin. She had on her blue suit with a white shirt, but with no tie. She regretted not having worn what she called her funeral coat, as it was only ever worn to funerals. It was smart, blue and long, and very expensive at the time she'd bought it, but that was in another lifetime, a lifetime when she had more money. She bought a Harley Davidson, a speedboat and a jet ski. She was wild and sporty, spending the summers water skiing and jet skiing, and often in the winter would snow ski. She had had enough disposable income to live a rather lavish lifestyle. She wanted for nothing. She was a director of a large successful organisation that at one time was the largest in the United Kingdom. It was almost like that life was a dream, something that had never existed, and often she would have to question her own mind as to whether it had ever been real. She slowly and carefully went down the few broken steps to the worn-out gravel pathway, to be met by the chickens that scuttled past her into the undergrowth. There was an outside swimming pool that had not been used for years, with some white plastic sun loungers that had gone yellow in the sun, clearly unused for a very long time. The area looked tired and worn out. She imagined the days when children would have played and screamed for joy as they jumped into the swimming pool. And parents would have just sat drinking top cocktails whilst a maid and a butler would probably pander to the needs of the wealthy homeowner. She had to traverse the scaffold to get to the front door, passing a large grey window that sat at the front of the darkened room. The large old front door was half glazed, and she could barely see into the dark hall that sat beyond it. The old handing doorbell sat to the left of the door, which always seemed to be the case. Rarely did it seem that the doorbell sat on the right of the door. She wondered why that was, as most people were right-handed. She hesitatingly pulled the brass chain of the bell which rang inside, and she nervously waited for someone to appear. She could hear a door open inside and saw the silhouette of a woman approaching the main door to give her access, who she guessed must be the therapist. The old door opened with a creak, and a semi-mature lady stood at the door. She was in her mid-40s. Her fringe was cut very high and showed a large area of her forehead. Her wavy hazel-coloured hair sat below her shoulders and was well groomed. She was dressed in clothing of what seemed to be a bygone era. She was wearing a tweed suit with a long flowing skirt with some sort of boots, and her jacket had what looked like part of a pheasant's feather pinned to it. She smiled and invited Charlotte into the hallway with a greeting and stood back to let Charlotte through. Charlotte immediately noted her lovely smile. It was real, as though Charlotte was an old long-lost friend from a past life. She immediately could feel the warmth which eased her nerves immediately. "Go straight in," she said gently. The smell of the old house struck her immediately. There was almost something comforting about it. It gave the feeling of security, of happiness, of cohesion, but she did not know why. The therapist walked behind Charlotte, and she followed her into the ground floor room to the right, and into the darkened room that passed behind the large bay window. The room suited the dress of the woman. It was very dated, with a musty smell and with a tinge of joss sticks. The furniture was old, walnut, and clearly expensive, but old and well used. There were large numbers of old original pictures on the walls, some of landscapes and some of portraits, and some that seemed to make little sense to her. Why were they there? What did they mean? Knickknacks sat on the mantelpiece of the old fireplace that had probably not been lit since the previous winter. It was hard to tell if this was part of her home or a room she rented within this old building for her counselling sessions. There was a bureau in the corner of the large room with lots of paperwork on it, and not neatly placed, and a rare to see old telephone. There was a desk sitting in the bay window with papers and an open laptop, which maybe she had been working on when Charlotte arrived. She guessed it contained all the secrets of her clients who came and went. It would hold the deepest and probably most painful parts of people's lives, and no doubt it would soon hold Charlotte's wretched and broken life's details. There was a Chinese screen sitting oddly dividing part of the room, which was not overly large but sufficient, but in a way it didn't seem to serve a purpose. It just took up space in the room. Charlotte sat down on the old brown leather Chesterfield sofa next to a coffee table, with a box of tissues sitting on it, along with a glass of water. The room was well prepared for the clients who would come on a regular basis to get help, whatever help was. But now it was made ready for her. Charlotte was an emotional wreck. She was hanging, breaking down constantly. Suicide was a constant companion. It was a shadow. It was the other half of her. In a way, it was her best friend, as well as her worst enemy. It was a paradox to her. She seemed to have a split personality, of one half desiring life and the other desiring death. But if weighed in the balance, she knew that a suicidal persuasion was the main character in her life. It took preeminence over her life. She didn't want life. She longed for death, and it was at her fingertips. The therapist sat down in an armchair opposite her that was probably about 100 years old, green with tassels on the edges and worn from years of use. She gave her another nice smile that put Charlotte at ease once more, although Charlotte could only focus on her fringe. Being transgender, she was well tuned into all things feminine, particularly women's hair, makeup and clothes, as well as frequently observing women's deportment, how they moved, acted and behaved. She wished even more that she'd born a woman when she studied them, how different things would have been for her. But no, she cursed the day she was ever born, but more so being born a man-child. What went wrong? Why was she like this? Why such confusion and torment? She'd often asked herself if God had made a mistake. After all, humanly speaking, no one was perfect. But everyone said God was perfect, who was a believer. But then why was she like she was? Why such confusion? Why such turmoil? And why such tragedy? The question was why, the overarching question of every other question. The therapist took her jacket off and made herself more comfortable. The room had an ambient temperature that was comfortable. She felt that it would be uncomfortable sitting in a room that was too hot or too cold. She wondered if the therapist had made sure that the room was just right. How could she know what worked for all of her clients? Surely they all had different temperature comfort zones. It was known that generally men and women have differing temperature thresholds. Being both, she wondered where she stood in that equation. Maybe somewhere in the middle. Why did you choose to come to me? The therapist asked, breaking the silence. Charlotte pondered for a second, even though she felt she knew why. Her sister had encouraged her to get help. She knew that she was spiraling, and if she didn't do something now, there would not be a tomorrow to do it. Well, my sister insisted. Well, she encouraged me, and I trawled through the endless lists of different therapists on the internet, looking at their pictures, reading their profile and trying to picture me talking to one. I discarded men because of my condition and chose you as someone that I felt I could talk to. It's hard to say, but that was really it, I think. You look right. I suppose I do a lot of things by gut reaction. If it feels right, then it probably is, but not always, of course. Would you like me to call you John or Charlotte? She asked. Charlotte had considered that this question would come up. She'd even considered coming as Charlotte, but for the first appointment she felt that it was too early, and she was not ready for such a bold decision. She was not confident enough to take that step at this time, for her or for the sake of the therapist. John will be fine, thanks, she replied, never quite sure if people would understand the dilemma of being two people, one male and one female. There was almost a madness to it when one thought about it. She thought so herself, so why shouldn't other people? I read what you sent me by email, and I can see the trauma that you've gone through. I have to tell you that I have never dealt with a transgender person before, so this will be a learning curve for me as well. I think that we can learn together and help one another. Are you okay with that? She asked. Charlotte was not surprised, but in a weird way she equally was surprised as well. Why she expected the therapist to have experience she did not know, but she thought that most therapists would have had some form of contact with the transgender community, but she did not see it as a problem. Her doctor had a number of transgender patients. As he had told her, they talked a lot about it, but he also thought he could learn from her and wanted to. They had a unique relationship. She had often considered that the world still had so much to learn about it, what it meant to be transgender. The biggest thing they needed to understand, she thought, was that it was not about a choice. And if they could all start at that point, then things would be easier to understand. The church needed to learn more so, she thought. There was this tunnel vision of intolerance and ignorance that many were not prepared to consider. It was sin, 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 and transgender people just had to repent, and that was the sum total of it. It was so desperately sad, she felt, as these are human beings struggling with a massive life-destroying issue, and the church mostly look the other way and shout out sin. Early in her marriage to Jane, after she had told her about her transgender issues, though it was not called that then, they went to see numbers of therapists, but one in particular stuck in her mind. They usually focused on seeing Christian therapists, but on this occasion they chose not to. The therapist was in her 50s, she guessed. After listening to what Charlotte had told her about her past, she immediately suggested that there had been child abuse in her childhood. Charlotte was staggered, as at no time that had ever happened that she could remember. But then she began to look back for any signs or indications that there might have been, but she was certain that there was nothing. She later found out there were numbers of therapists who were using this accusation as a means to justify why certain people had certain issues. She felt disgusted in a way, as it started her mind searching for abuse when she was certain there was none. She felt that she was betraying her parents' memory and the love that they'd always shown to her. Not perfectly, of course, but she knew her parents loved her. It had been an awful session that only added to her awful dilemma and anxiety. She received hypnosis and acupuncture, each therapist believing that they had the magical and mysterious solution to cure her. But over the years and after each session, she realised that there was no magical solution to take away the trauma. It was for life, and it crushed her even more. After every session, she felt worse than the one before. It was a spiralling downward problem that seemed to be heading to disaster and ultimately suicide. I'll stop there. That's 24 minutes and 23 seconds. Well, sorry for the mistakes along the way, but hopefully it will give you a bit of a taste of what's to come. There's a lot more. It talks about my past life and the violence and the drugs and the drinking and the women, and so many other things. The last part of the book, I have to admit, is fiction. Not all. I did get COVID badly, and it was at one point touch and go, or maybe a number of times touch and go as to where actually I'd make it. I had pneumonia twice and inflammation of the lungs, and then long COVID as well. And that's the point where the book gets to, so the story gets to. So anyway, I'll leave it there. I wish you all well. I hope you've had a good day. I've got a little bit sunburnt today sitting out in the garden. It's a beautiful day, and I had a day off after doing the garden and cleaning the house and doing the washing and doing some ironing. I had a bit of a chill day reading a great book called Destined for War by Graham Allison, which is, if you're into current affairs and issues in the South China Sea and the conflicts of America and China, couldn't recommend it more. It's probably one of the best books that I've ever read. So well done, Graham. Brilliant book, and I hope that many people will learn from it. So I wish you all well. Hope you sleep well tonight and have a good day tomorrow. God bless. Bye.